I'm Megan Blackburn. I'm the head of adult services here. Just wanted to let you know through that door there is a couple restrooms if you should need them. They're just up a couple stairs. So we need them, they're right there. I'm here to introduce a man who needs no introduction, Dr. Robert Brown. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you for putting up with me for the last 5 months. This kind of ends the exercise. Those of you who've been along for one or more of these are now better acquainted with the kind of holdings we have in this place. And more importantly, the issue I've been trying to point out is what you do with them. Why it's not just an accumulation of stuff. I love maps. I have framed antique maps on the walls of my house, and a bunch more that my wife won't let me put up that are stuffed away in the corner. I've always loved maps. I love maps both as art, and they quite often are that, and also for the information they give us, and for the ability to take us to a specific point in time and place and get a sense of what life was like. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the variety of maps that we have here in our collection and what you can do with them again. And I want to start with topographic maps. Now, as those of you who are here at the beginning may remember, I said that the idea behind all of this was I was going to get 12 or 15 people together on a winter's afternoon and sit around a table so you could get up close with these documents and look at them. And the numbers got bigger than that, so obviously you can't get up close and look at the documents. But a topographic map, where I want to start, is very simple. It's a map of elevations. They're created by the U.S. government. They've been around. The U.S. survey began in the mid-19th century. They've been around since then. We've got a variety of them from a variety of dates. They show elevation, and they show landforms thus, and they show waterways. Now, these are topographic maps. And by the way, Westfield never is central to any of the topographic maps that exist. In this quadrant, part of Westfield's down in the corner. In this topographic, Westfield is so small you can't even see it. So that's not going to do much good. So what I decided to do was to revert to my old academic days and pretend I'm standing in front of a blackboard. And I'm going to draw some of the main topographic features. So at least you should be able to see them that way. Now, the first feature are the rivers. And to the north, we have the Great River. Now, when the first settlers came here, they called it the Warnoke River. That's what was the Indian name for it. They always called it the Great River. And in fact, it continued that up until the 19th century, when suddenly it became Westfield's River. To the south, if we've got the Great River to the north, to the south, we've got the Little River. So Westfield sits between the two rivers. But there's a lot more water than that, because those rivers are fed by, many seats over here, come ahead, are fed by a number of streams which today you wouldn't even notice. But if you drop back 300 years when the landforms were different and the waterfall was different, those were fairly important streams. Starting in the west on the north, there is Moose Meadow Brook that comes out of Toccoa Mountain and was the source of the original waterworks of Westfield. In the middle, coming out of Montgomery Mountain, there is Go ahead, there's more seats over there. There is Sackett Brook, but it's more commonly known today as Powder Mill Brook. And it's the brook that comes down from Wyben, runs across the street at Mestec, parallels Union Street, and then runs into the river at Union Street. So there we go with Sackett Brook or Moose Meadow Brook. And finally, there is Pond Brook. That, just as its name says, drains Hampden Ponds. And it runs right down Shaker Road into the river. The three on the north are matched by ones in the south. Come on in, Walt.
Is it really Shaker Road?
Pardon?
Is it Shaker Road?
No. Shaker Road's down here.
Correct.
On the far west is Munns Meadow Brook, and that's one that most people don't pay any attention to, but it drains parts of Southwick and Granville. And there is finally the Great Brook, which actually drains Congamon Lakes. Now, if you get the Westfield Evening News or if you're familiar with Southwick, you may know that they're having all kinds of issues about fixing the drains for the ponds down there because they can't control the water level. That's because in '55, the drains were screwed up. But the Great Brook drains, supposedly, Congamon Lakes, and that's the one along Shaker Road, and it runs into the river. Now, that's not all, because there are internal brooks. There is the Town Brook. Now, the Town Brook rises in Grandmother's Garden, comes down along King Street, underneath the Washington Street housing for the elderly, roughly underneath the police station. Then it makes a sharp bend and runs parallel to Elm Street, crosses Franklin roughly in the parking lot for CVS, comes behind CVS, between CVS and the courthouse, and crosses Elm Street there, crosses St. Mary's parking lot. It comes out about where the gate to St. Mary's parking lot is on Mechanic Street, goes around East Bartlett Street, around the corner of White Street, then crosses Meadow Street, somewhere in the vicinity of Corey DeGray's garage, parallels behind what was Mosley House on Main Street and those apartments that are in there, and then runs into the river. So this is a major brook that runs in the north. There's another major brook that runs in the south. It's called the Spruce Brook, and that comes out of Hospital Hill. Part of it survived up until fairly modern times. On Cortez Street there was a pond, and it flows across the streets in the south out of Hospital Hill, crosses Broad Street, just the big Y side of First and Adams, goes through the property that was the Ashley Street School. Some of you may remember just a couple of years ago there was a major battle over what was going to happen on that piece of property. There was a local residential group in opposition to the plans for that, and they came in and I showed them this and showed them how that area of marsh, because that was all marsh, that got filled in with slag and casting sand from H.B. Smith, and suddenly the plans for what was going to happen on that polluted site disappeared. But anyway, that runs that way. Now, this is only the two biggest internal streams. In 1889, the city decided to build its first sewer system. And it created a massive map on onion skin, which is why I didn't bring it in here. It's very fragile, of all the internal streams. And there are a half dozen others. Some of you familiar with First Church may know that there's one that runs under First Church. These streams were extensive because this whole area in here was a swamp. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that this part of Westfield was not settled until 150 years after the original settlers came, because this was a swamp. It had to be drained and filled in. In 1889, when they created this big onion skin map, it showed all of those internal streams that I'm not going to drive on here today. What they did, the first sewer system, they channeled out those stream beds and bricked them over. So the streams were the first sewer system. At least part of the sewer system for this part of Westfield remains that to this day.
That's a good idea.
Now, those streams still flow. They're still underground. If you live down in this section of Westfield, on the streets just north of Silver, between Silver and Mill, if you live in that area, I've had various people come and tell me, well, my basement gets wet every year, or my backyard is wet all the time. Well, that's because that was the spruce swamp, and those streams that drain this highlands up here still run. Since I've lived in town, the main stream, the stream for this thing, and this was a major brook, the stream for that thing has collapsed in the Franklin Street area and what was then Davio's restaurant, where CVS is, half a dozen times. And it's always been because they have to go down, and it's just a brick. You can walk in the blooming thing. As late as Civil War, they were catching salmon where the Westfield Police Station is today. That was a major stream. There was a swimming hole on Franklin Street, approximately where CVS is today, that was utilized by the kids in the neighborhood in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. There was a skating rink just off Pleasant Street where this crossed Pleasant Street. There was a skating rink there up through the 1890s. So if you live in this area and you got wet basements, there's a good reason for that. I mean, it happens. They're still there. Now, okay, what does that tell us about history? One, it tells us that water power was very important in the history of Westfield. All of these streams could produce energy in a world where the steam engine is minimal and the gasoline engine hasn't been invented. And on every one of these streams, there were mills, and just as important, there were mill dams. Now, those mill dams become crucial in the 20th century. Because by the 20th century, the mills are not in existence anymore, but the dams are there. And so when you get a rainstorm, from a hurricane like 36 or 38, or most particularly like 55, you get a wall of water building up behind those small mill dams. And they haven't been taken care of for 100 years. And they suddenly let go. Well, if you really want to look, and some of you may have seen the slideshows I've done of Westfield in the 40s and 50s, when I show the slides of 1955 on the north side, when the mill dams on this stream, Sackett Brook, Powder Mill Brook, let go, and it wiped out the businesses on the north end. That wall of water that came rushing down. So water power was terribly important in Westfield history. The other crucial ingredient of Westfield history throughout its history, and it remains today, as much as we like to put blinkers over our eyes and pretend it is not happening, this area floods. Now, this area right in here, downtown Westfield, from the Little River Bridge, where the Little River comes in on East Main Street, to the base of Pine Hill, is about 3 miles long. And it's just under up to a half mile wide. It's a relatively small area. The settlers came here because, one, there was water power. Two, in this kind of marshy area, there were beaver. And three, because this area flooded all the time, there were no big trees. Big trees don't grow in spruce swamps. So you can, if you got a little high ground, you can plow it and plant it. This area, its elevation is between 130 and 150 feet high. If the Greenland ice caps really do start seriously melting, or the Antarctic ice caps really start seriously melting, Westfield will be underwater. Downtown Westfield. If you live up on Western Avenue, you're okay, but downtown Westfield is going to be underwater. This area is between 130 and 150 feet in elevation. The north bank of the Westfield River is 50 feet higher. So if there's a flood, it's always south of the river. On this side, we get the road to Southwick, and you obviously all can see, there's the hill. You jump up 50, 75 feet. So to the south, there's a range of hills. If you go up to Western Avenue to roughly where Pine Hill Cemetery is, you suddenly have jumped to 200 feet in elevation. And by the time you get to Bates Road, Upper Western Avenue, you're very close to 300 feet in elevation. And within a very short distance, you jump to 1,000 feet in elevation. So the Great River drains an area of 500 square miles. Elevation anywhere from 1,000 feet up to 1,700 feet high. When it rains up there in the Berkshires, in Chester and Otis and Huntington, and if it rains hard, the Great River rises fast. The Little River, it's only got a drainage area of about 200 square miles. But it's the same thing. If it rains real hard in the southern Berkshires and up around Granville and up in there, that Little River can come up very, very fast. There usually was at least one flood a year in downtown Westfield. Quite often 2 a year, spring flood and fall flood. It was normal in Westfield throughout the 1600s and 1700s and early 1800s. It was normal. Didn't matter much because when the water comes pouring off those mountains, hits this flatland, it spreads out fast and it disappears fast. So 48 hours later, the water levels recede. You're just a farmer out there anyway. Besides, it's deposited a fresh new layer of good topsoil and it's watered the soil and you get on with your business. As we get into the 19th century, however, we begin to industrialize. Now you're damaging real property. We got to do something. So they begin to build dikes along the great river, because that's where the greatest danger comes from. Problem is, if you build a dike, it's got to be built on the south side of the river. North side of the river's higher, it doesn't matter. If you build a dike, that works fine, but how about 50 feet above the dike? The water's going to flow over there. Well, that's kind of okay in the early years because that's just farmland in Upper Route 20, Upper Franklin Street. That's just farmland out there. That's okay. But with the growth of the town, you constantly have to extend the dikes. By the time we get into the 20th century, there's enough development and enough crisis that, things are getting out of hand. We have serious property loss floods. 1927, 1933, 1934, 1936, 1938, 1942, 1948, and 2 in 1955. People forget we had the devastating flood in the early summer of 55, and then in October we had a second one. Something had to be done. Westfield's a city now, and this is property loss. This is damage. Sometimes quite serious damage. So they build dams. Cobble Mountain Dam on the Little River, Knightville and Littleville on branches of the Westfield River, and since 55 we have kind of sat here. But our memories fade. In 1980 and again in 1987, we had those disastrous rains. The water rose so high that the civil defense warnings went out that the possibility was to overtop the dams. People were evacuated in Huntington. There was fear the dams were going to let go. And so to defend the dams, they released huge amounts of water. We've forgotten. 1980, there were 5 feet of water on Union Street. It was 5 feet deep. 1987, it was 4 to 5 feet deep on East Main Street. And in years since then, there have been smaller floods on East Main Street, Union Street, Franklin Avenue, Upper Route 20, Toccoa Country Club. The flood potential is still there. And there have been no repairs whatsoever to Knightville or Littleville. Knightville was built in 1941. It's coming up on a century old. Littleville is newer. That was built in 1965. Cobble Mountain, nobody's looked at that thing, except to tell you that the dikes on the south side of the city are in bad shape. Floods are a reality. And if you look at those topographic maps, you can understand exactly why. Now, there are other kinds of maps and other kinds of issues and other kinds of history. One of the continuous requests that we've gotten in the library in the 30 to 40 years that I've been associated with it is people coming in and saying, I live in so-and-so on this street. What can you tell me about my house? Or I've heard my house is the oldest house on the street, or something along that kind of line. We get those requests all the time. There are ways of answering those questions, and I know that a few of you sitting right here have raised those questions with me recently, and I'm going to show you, at least in part, how we solve those issues today, particularly if you have an older house. First of all, you need maps of Westfield that show location of people and places. The first map we have of Westfield that does that is a 1793 map, and it's no help at all, because it simply was drawn by a guy sitting down at a desk and saying, well, here's where they are. He didn't even worry about north and south and east and west. You have to spend a half an hour twisting around to figure out which end is up. Luckily, at the end of the 19th century, Westfield had its first and only official historian. His name was Louis Marius Dewey. He worked for the whip industry. He was an amateur historian, very dedicated one, and he had a second job. He was a professional genealogist. He's one of those people that you could hire to trace your family genealogy. Now, if you've ever done any genealogical work here in the library, you may know that people send you, first of all, to the Dewey Notes. Essentially, that's the results of the research he did on Westfield families. He had the kind of mind that works best for genealogists. He loved minutia. I mean, he really was caught up in old deeds, and it's always bored the hell out of me, to tell you the truth. I can't imagine anything more boring than try to trace old deeds. But anyway, he did that. And to understand who people were and where they lived and what their relationship was to each other and what the documents meant when they said something, he hand drew maps. So he was in this position late 1880s to right after the First World War. Against that wall are a couple of examples of his hand-drawn maps. This one is the first settlement of Westfield. And it includes the original land grants, and it gives you historical indication and the names that things were called and who lived where. And this is Little River Road. And this is simply another version of Little River Road. These are the original land grants out there. And he's worked out who lived where. So if you're really dealing with very early history, you start with some of his maps. By the way, we have a number of others. They're mostly on tracing paper. They're not the sort of thing I haul around from one place to another. But for instance, he's got Shaker Road on there, and he's got Wyben on there, and two or three others where he's drawn out who lived where. For more practical purposes, we have to start with the commercial maps. And there are a number of them. I just want to make sure I can list the dates actually. We have maps which show streets, houses, and who owned the houses and property. We have maps from 1831, 1853, 1870 beers. It's this. The 1831 is here, or sorry, 1853 is here. And the others, you have to go to atlases. Now, we're really lucky in that they produced some great atlases. This is an atlas of Hampden County. Every community in Hampden County, and this is watercolor, so they're bright. Every community in Hampden County is included in here with the location of all the buildings. There's West Springfield, for instance. The maps are used and people are constantly taking them out and putting them back. These are ones from the archives so that they're loose maps. But there's every property and who owned it. So that's Beers. In 1885, some entrepreneur decided that there would be money to be made making an atlas just for Westfield. And so this is every street in Westfield in watercolor, once again, with every piece of property and who owns it. The commercial prospects seemed to grow greater, and so in 1894 and 1914, they did the Hampden County atlases again. These are by Richards, and again, it is town by town in Hampden County, so if you're from Southwick or Russell or Wyben or Holyoke or Chicopee, the maps of the property are here with the ownership of all the properties. Now, there are other ways of doing it because they decided that people really love properties, and so they created bird's eyes. These were very popular in the 19th century. And when you think about it, this is from 1875. And by the way, this is a copy of the original. In the 1969 300th anniversary of Westfield, they mass produced this and sold it as a souvenir. I've got one framed in my house. What they did is they shot a balloon up in the air. And the balloonist took an aerial photograph. And then they transferred that information to street maps. So aerial photos are astonishingly accurate for the big buildings, all the prominent buildings. You can take this 1870 aerial photo of Westfield, this bird's eye of Westfield, and you can take an outline of a building and match it to some photographs that we have here. And for prominent buildings, they match. They're very, very accurate. Now, this doesn't tell you who owns the property, but you can see the layout of the land. By the way, this was done again in 1894. That one is much scarcer. We've got a couple of damaged ones in here. Of this, we've got a couple of hundred, but we've got a couple of damaged ones of the 1894. To go along with that, by the time airplanes came along, from the 1830s, we have aerial photos of central Westfield. And again, it really only works for central Westfield, for downtown Westfield, but the information is here. This happens to be one in the 1950s because Second Congregational Church is still downtown. The Methodist Church still has the great big old steeple. H.B. Smith is still prominent. The professional building is still on the map, but we also have them for the 1830s. And you can see the construction equipment for Grandmother's Garden as they're beginning to set that in. So these can give you, particularly in conjunction with others, they can give you very useful information. The final atlas, and this is one that people really don't know about. This is the Sanborn atlases. Now, Sanborn creates insurance maps. If you're an insurance agent and someone comes to you and says, I want to insure my house, in the days when agents pretty much set up policies by themselves, how much insurance can you put on a place? Well, you got to know the size of the building, construction of the building, cost of replacement. You got to know all those things. Sanborn was a company that in the 19th century went around the United States and began to produce street maps of properties and using codes identifying buildings by their construction material, locating porches and outbuildings and windows and telling you how many stories the property was, so that you, as an insurance agent, can buy the Sanborn map for your town. And then simply when the customer comes in and says, I live on such and such a street, you open the map to that page and you can locate their house. And by the way, someone says, how do I trace properties? These don't have names, but these have the street addresses on them. The street number is here. So you can see, did your house have a porch front and back? Did they change the siding? Did they tear down that garage that used to be back there? You can tell it from these Sanborn maps. And we have a collection of Sanborn maps from, I think, the earliest or the late 1870s on up to the early 1950s. And I can tell you that the national Sanborn maps are on the internet. You can go to them and you can search almost any town for almost any year. There is a national site for these things. So enormous information is available to you if you want. When you get all that map stuff, what do you do with it? Well, you then go to another source in the library, city directories. If you go up to the reference desk, you'll see that by the side of the reference desk, there's a long line of kind of orange volumes there. That's the city directories. City directories began in the United States in the 1830s. Westfield's first one is, I think, 1875. I think that's when it began here. They're issued every year. City directories were not produced for you. They were produced for businessmen. So when a customer comes in and wants to establish a credit line, the city directory can go and see, where do you live? Have you got boarders in the house? What's your job? How many people live in the house? And by tracking you in the city directory year from year, they can see what you are as a customer. Or in the days before the internet, when you got a call on the telephone and it's some insurance agent and he seems to know too much about you, it's because he's gone to the city directory and he's tracked you. We worry about internet accumulating information on you. What most people didn't realize is they've been accumulating information on you in paper ways for a great deal of time. So you can go to the city directory, find your house, track who lived there, and then track that person if you wish, if you're trying to trace genealogy, or track who moves into the house after that person leaves. You can track the ownerships in your house. So these are the tools that we have at hand, all associated with maps and map associations. There are just a couple of other things I want to bring to your attention. Transportation. Now, the first big transportation revolution was, of course, the canal. Everybody is familiar with the canal and what it did or didn't do in Westfield, and basically it did very little in Westfield. The canal was a disaster. It really was not very successful. It was part of a national canal building craze, of which probably the most famous and most successful was the Erie Canal, which in some ways still exists today as the New York State Barge Canal, still functioning in a way. Canals were being built everywhere. Now this is pre-railroad. You've got to have a way of getting bulk material from one place to another cheaply, and canals would do it. So somebody down in New York City looked and said, look at that Connecticut River. There's a nice straight line. It runs all the way almost to Montreal. Wouldn't that be a wonderful road to the interior? Problem was that rivers are highly fluctuating in their flow. The Connecticut River is very shallow for important parts of the year. It has extensive series of rapids and falls in it. It's at least up until, Windsor, I guess. It's pretty good for communication up to about Windsor, but above that, it's not really good for communication. So the idea is to build a canal parallel to it and utilize the water and the towns associated. Not a bad idea in the canal building world. So in the 1820s, a group of investors got together and created a perspective map for this canal. We're very lucky we have a copy of that perspective map. I did not bring it to you. We had it conserved a number of years ago and it is framed, but it shows what their plan was in building this canal from essentially New Haven to Montreal. And they then went out and tried to raise money. Well, as you know, they began construction and ultimately the canal reached Westfield. Then it stopped for a couple of years and then they dug futilely and they made it to Northampton and linked back with the Connecticut River. And unfortunately, by that time, the railroads arrived. And the canal was done for. The canal, however, survived in Westfield as a water source. And the canal was kept open as a water source for the whip industries. It mostly terminated at the head of Franklin Street. There was a strip of whip industries right in there opposite where Franklin Street comes into Elm. And that's where the canal terminated. It kept open till the coming of electricity in the 1880s. They built the railroad alongside it. The railroad was all the canal crossings. And as the town grew, the horses and buggies got crazy with the railroads running across the streets, so they elevated the railroad. Well, that worked very well until they invented tractor trailers. So then they decided to pull the bridges out because that was stopping tractor trailers, and anyway, the trains didn't run anymore. Then somebody got a bright idea of having bicycles, and so they put the bridges back. So we're still living with the canal in one way or another. The canal fascinates people for a whole lot of reasons. And consequently, a retired doctor from Noble Hospital, Carl Walters, who is fixated more than any human being ought to be on a single subject, has devoted his life to the canal. He knows more about the canal than any other human being has ever known about anything. And one of the things he did is he created this magnificent map of the Hampshire and Hamden Canal. And if any of you have the faintest idea, it's a modern topographic map with every single detail of the canal written on it, with some of his photographs and historical photographs on the back. It is a wonderful, modern historical document for tracking all things canal and rights-of-way and feeder canals and dams and all the rest. They're all here. One other transportation type of maps that I want to bring to your attention. Most city directories of the 20th century included a street map. So if you got a Westfield city directory for 1914, folded up in the front, there was a onion skin street map of Westfield. That would show all major streets and all transportation lines. Some people are fascinated by trolleys. And I don't think people in Westfield realize just how extensive the trolley system was. Now here is simply a Xerox copy of the map for 1912, and it marks out all the trolley lines as they ran all the way out Western Avenue and Bates Road, as they rode all the way Mills Street to the Crane Mills and such, as they rode all the way out Union Street to the paper mills on Union Street. You could literally, for a nickel or a dime, get anywhere in Westfield on a trolley. And that was true, by the way, in most American towns and cities. The trolley system was a wonderful transportation system for cities. Certainly much better than automobiles for cities, much better. It wasn't, they decided, they got carried away with trolleys and decided, well, I ought to be able to get on a trolley at the Green in Westfield and ride to Albany. Well, you didn't really want to ride in an open car in the middle of winter to Albany. You didn't want to do that. But if you lived in downtown Westfield and you worked at the paper mill on Union Street, rather than walking out there on a cold winter's morning, it was a lot easier to pay your nickel and get on the trolley and get a ride. So if you're interested in the development of those kinds, it also, by the way, shows bus routes. And up to First World War, there were stagecoaches in Westfield also that ran to the hill towns. So you've even got the stagecoach lines on here. So maps will do all kinds of interesting things if you know where to look. The staff here are familiar with all of these. The staff can help you look at those things, and if necessary, help you interpret what they tell you. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Yeah.
Where was the paper mill on Union Street? Was it part of the canal? Because I'm thinking of the canal.
It is very hard to believe, but if you will go on Union Street, where paper mill and, what's the other street? What is it? Springdale come together. If if you can find it, there's a stoplight there now. And if you can find a way to just pull over the side, pull into the parking lot that used to be the radio station and stand there and look. Between those two streets, there's a pump house for the Westfield Waterworks. Up until the 1930s, there was a 4-story brick factory in that niche. And behind it was a flume. There was a dam above it that dammed the water coming down on Pond Brook, coming down from the western ponds, and a flume that brought water power to that paper mill. It ceased being a paper mill, I think, in the 20s, and then it became a gelatin factory. I forgot, and I do not know when the building was torn down, but I know the dam was washed away in the '55 flood. So it may be that the building was destroyed at that point in time. I don't know when it disappeared. Directly across from it, there's a gas station, or a service station. There was a stop there for the trolley line, and there was a stop for the railroad line, which is behind it. So that you could, because they had to supply goods to the paper mill. So you're not very far away from that railroad line, it's the other side. And there was a little shunt there to connect with the railroad line. All long gone, people long forgot, and you can only see by looking at these maps. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Westfield is a very important city in history before the colonials arrived, because the Dutch knew about Westfield, and they had established from Hartford area a trading company already in Westfield. Westfield used to be called Streamfield for the reasons that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So it was full of skins, beaver hides, and which the Dutch knew about already. So Westfield was actually a huge, very significant Native American area that was known about other things. And the settlers settled along South Maple Street. We have Squawfield Road there, because all of that area were squaw fields.
Yeah, it was farmland, yeah.
Right, it was the farmlands. So the ancient history of Westfield as an important city was very expensive before the settlers got here. King Philip's War happened in the 1670s. So I wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, and if you look
and I'm wondering if that black map
that shows it
turned into a white map, reversed
it might be. I'm not quite sure why he did it on architect's paper. I don't know, but that's...
I think it's like a negative or something.
Yeah, that's the only copies we have are on that blue paper. We have 3 copies of that. Mm-hmm. I brought this one down because it's framed. But these maps can show you all kinds of things about Westfield history. Anything else? Yeah.
If anyone wants to experience and see the modern day current flooding situation and capability of the streams, the sanctuary in Stanley Park. You go down the back and there's actual signs there that when Cobble Mountain releases their water, horns will blow, let you know that you can see the silt throughout the whole sanctuary. And just picture it coming up and engulfing that whole sanctuary. And that's, to this day, it's still...
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is normal for humans to forget, to lose track of. And as I said, we've forgotten that as recently as 1980, yeah, I know that's 45 years ago, it's a long time ago, but as recently as 1980, there was 6 feet of water on Union Street. And there's been a lot of growth and development since then.
What part of Union Street?
The whole stretch of it.
Well, also mentioning Union Street, there's a place called Guida Farm, which is the high area which was a Native American
Yeah, that's where
area.
they had settled.
Right, because all along Union Street was also for 2 miles or whatever it is there. And then Pachasik on the other side was also Native American habitation.
Yeah, again, it's on that map right there. You can see
So
them.
where's the low area? Because Hokkaido Farm is the high area.
That still went underwater. I mean, that's high compared to where we were talking about where the streams come in on Paper Mill, because that is a lower dip of the ground in there. All right, thank you. Guy, do you want to make any comments, any announcements you want to make?
Well, I just want to say, we have summer reading coming up, starting next week. So if you want to join that, feel free to do that. We've got the trips to Tanglewood the trip to Tanglewood is full. So I hope there's tickets want to go because it's totally full. There may be 1 or 2 tickets left. I'm not sure about that. Basically, that's full. But look for future travel trips because we're going to have a couple coming up soon for that. So that's about it for me.
Okay.
Was there a dam under the Westfield Bridge, the first Westfield Bridge? Was that ever dammed in any way? Because
There were always dams on the Westfield River. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. The series is ended. Thank you for coming.